Christmas Eve. Most people my age are wrapping last-minute gifts or driving to someone's house with a casserole dish and a bottle of wine. I was standing in the middle of the Charlotte Greyhound bus terminal at 11 o'clock at night, wearing my late father's old flannel jacket, with exactly $4 crumpled in my coat pocket and a cell phone so dead it might as well have been a paperweight. My stepmother had pressed it into my hand 4 hours earlier with a smile I now understood was not a farewell. It was a period at the end of a very long sentence she had been writing for years. The terminal smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows, half of them occupied by people asleep under their coats or staring at departure boards with the glazed patience of people who had learned that waiting was just another word for surviving. A vending machine in the corner buzzed and flickered. A janitor pushed a mop in slow, patient arcs across the far end of the hall, the sound of it rhythmic, almost meditative. Nobody looked at me. Nobody saw the woman in the corner near the lockers standing so still she might have been furniture, trying to hold herself together by sheer force of will. I need to go back to the beginning. I need you to understand what kind of family I came from before I can explain how I ended up alone in that terminal on Christmas Eve with a dead phone and my father's ghost sewn into the lining of everything I was wearing. My father was a civil engineer. He built bridges, which felt significant in a way I never fully unpacked until much later. He was a tall, quiet man who made good coffee and terrible pancakes and had a habit of humming the same song whenever he was concentrating on something. "You are my sunshine." Not singing it, just humming it under his breath while he read blueprints at the kitchen table or fixed something under the sink. It was the most unconscious thing about him, that humming, the sound of a man at peace with where he was. My mother died when I was 4, a car accident on I-85, a Tuesday morning in October. I have no memory of her that I can trust as real rather than assembled from photographs. My father raised me alone in a house outside of Raleigh, and for the first 10 years of my life, that was the whole world. Him and me and the humming and the coffee and the bridges he was always drawing in the margins of notebooks. He met my stepmother when I was 11. Her name was Diane. She was a real estate agent with highlighted hair and a laugh that always seemed to be performing for an audience just out of frame. My father was quiet. She was loud in a way that looked like warmth from the outside. I understood, even at 11, that she was something he needed and something I did not trust, and I was old enough to know that both of those things could be true at the same time. They married when I was 13. A small ceremony. I was the only guest who was also family. At the reception, Diane put her hand on my shoulder and told me how happy she was to have a daughter. Her hand felt possessive in a way that hands should not feel. The years that followed had a particular texture to them. Nothing overtly cruel. Nothing I could point to. Just a slow, steady pressure, like someone gradually turning down the heat in a room and waiting to see how long before you notice you are cold. Diane made suggestions about my clothes, my friends, my plans for college. The suggestions hardened into expectations. The expectations hardened into rules. My father did not seem to notice, or if he did, he chose not to see it, and I learned that love and willful blindness can occupy the same person simultaneously. I went to college in Charlotte, 2 hours away, which felt like freedom. I studied nursing, graduated, got a job, built a small life with an apartment I paid for myself and friends who knew me only as the version of me that existed outside of that house. I called my father every Sunday. We talked about his projects, my patients, the weather, everything and nothing. He always hummed a few bars before he hung up. I never told him how much that meant to me. He died 18 months ago. A sudden heart attack, the doctors said. 61 years old. No prior history of cardiac problems. I drove back to Raleigh the same day and walked into a house that felt like the furniture had been rearranged by someone who did not know what the furniture was for. Diane was composed in a way that struck me even then as something other than grief. Efficient. Already on the phone with the estate lawyer before we had even made arrangements for the funeral. I told myself I was reading things into her because I had never liked her. I told myself grief looks different in different people. I told myself my discomfort was my problem. I was wrong about all three. 3 weeks after the funeral, the estate lawyer sent me a letter. My father had left me everything. The house, the savings, the 30-year pension from the engineering firm, and a life insurance policy worth $600,000. The total estate was valued at just over $2 million. I was 27 years old, and I had no idea any of this money existed. There was also a trust. Established 15 years ago when I was 12, a year after my father met Diane. The Mitchell Family Trust. Beneficiary: Emma Grace Mitchell, his only child. Value at the time of his death: $1.4 million. A separate fund, structured so that Diane could not touch it, held in my name alone. My father had been careful in a way I had not known about. What I also did not know was that Diane had spent the 18 months since his death working with a financial advisor to challenge the trust's validity. She had filed a legal claim arguing that my father had intended to update the trust to include her as a co-beneficiary and had simply never gotten around to it. Her attorney was Daniel Marsh, a man whose name I would learn to say the way you say a word that tastes bad. I found out about the legal challenge 3 days before Christmas, when the estate lawyer's office sent a secondary notification to an old email address I rarely checked. By then, Diane had already done something else. Something I did not realize until I was standing in the Charlotte Greyhound terminal with $4 and a dead phone on Christmas Eve. She had called me 2 days before Christmas, voice warm and smooth in the way it always was when she wanted something. "There was a box of my father's things at the house in Raleigh," she said. "Books. Some engineering notebooks, a photograph she thought I would want. She could not mail them because some of them were fragile. Would I come and get them before the holidays?" It would mean so much to her to see me. We should not spend Christmas as strangers. I drove to Raleigh on Christmas Eve because he was my father, and those were his things, and I wanted them. I drove to that house because some part of me had not yet fully accepted what I knew about Diane in my bones. I wanted to be wrong. People always want to be wrong about the people they are supposed to be able to trust. The box was real. The photographs were real. His engineering notebooks, his handwriting in the margins, his neat, careful diagrams. I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes looking at a photograph of him and me at the beach when I was 7, both of us squinting into the sun. He was laughing. I do not remember the day, but I remember the feeling of it, the salt air and his hand holding mine so I would not get knocked down by the waves. Diane sat across from me with a cup of coffee and a performance of nostalgia so polished it almost worked. Almost. When I stood to leave, she told me my car had a flat. She had noticed it in the driveway, she said. Such terrible timing. She had already called a neighbor to come look at it, but he would not be available until morning. She had already taken the liberty of booking me a spot on the night bus back to Charlotte from the station downtown, she said, because she had a friend picking her up in an hour and she needed to lock up the house. She handed me a printed ticket and my overnight bag from the guest room, which she had apparently already packed for me. She also handed me my cell phone with an apology about having borrowed the charger and a promise that it had plenty of battery. I walked out of that house at 9:30 in the evening with a bus ticket, my father's box, my overnight bag, and a phone that I discovered 20 minutes later had been wiped and reset to factory settings. There was nothing on it. No contacts, no photos, no banking app, no way to call anyone. The bus had already left by the time I reached the terminal. The ticket Diane had printed was for a 9:15 departure. She had sent me out of the house at 9:30. The next bus to Charlotte did not leave until 6 in the morning. The woman at the counter looked at my ticket and my face and told me she was sorry. I stood at the counter for a moment trying to construct a sentence and could not find one. I walked to the corner near the lockers and sat down on the floor with my father's box and my overnight bag and tried to think. My wallet was in the bag. The main pocket, where I always kept it. I opened the bag and found a cardigan I did not pack, a paperback novel I had never seen, a travel toothbrush, a change of clothes that were not mine. Diane had repacked my bag. My wallet was gone. My driver's license was gone. My credit cards were gone. The only thing left was a small pocket in the lining where I sometimes kept emergency cash, which held 4 crumpled dollars and an old loyalty card from a coffee shop that closed 2 years ago. I sat on the floor of the terminal and understood with complete clarity what had happened. She had planned it. Not spontaneously, not carelessly. She had planned every detail with the same efficiency she had used to call the estate lawyer before my father was even buried. The flat tire, the neighbor who was unavailable, the bus ticket timed to miss the bus, the phone wiped clean, the bag repacked without my identification. She had sent me 2 hours from home on Christmas Eve with nothing. And whatever she was doing back at that house, she had bought herself the night to do it. I do not know how long I sat on the floor. Long enough for the terminal to thin out, for the departure board to stop cycling new routes, for the vending machine to complete 3 full cycles of its flickering. The cleaning smell grew stronger as the janitorial staff worked their way through the building. At some point, the lights in the far section dimmed. Someone across the hall was playing quiet music from a phone, something country and gentle that I could not quite make out. Then, a voice, unhurried, not close enough to crowd me. "You look like somebody who just had Christmas stolen from them." I looked up. The janitor. An older man, maybe 65, dark skin, close-cropped silver hair. He was leaning on his mop at a respectful distance, not looking at me directly, the way you might approach a stray dog you did not want to startle. His uniform had the bus terminal logo on the chest, but the patches on the sleeves told a different story, methodically repaired over time. His boots were clean despite everything. "I am fine," I said, which was such an obvious lie I almost laughed. He nodded slowly like he was taking the statement under advisement. "Been watching you for a while," he said. "Not trying to alarm you, just the way I am wired after 30 years working nights. You notice the ones who are not where they are supposed to be." I did not answer. He reached into his cart, that battered, practical cart that held everything necessary for keeping a space clean, and produced a bottle of water and a small packet of peanut butter crackers, set them on the floor 3 feet away from me without stepping into my space. "Some habits die hard," he said. "My wife always said I treated the whole world like it was a job site that needed maintaining." I picked up the crackers. I had not eaten since noon. His name was Walter. He had worked the overnight shift at the Charlotte terminal for 11 years. Before that, he had been a logistics supervisor for a regional freight company. A good job. A career he had built over 2 decades, a pension he had been 4 years away from collecting when the company accused him of falsifying delivery records. None of it was true. The records had been altered by his direct supervisor, a man named Carl who needed someone to absorb the liability before an audit. Walter spent 14 months fighting the charges, depleted every dollar he had in legal fees, and was ultimately cleared, but cleared too late. The job gone, the savings gone, his marriage strained past repairing. He told me this without self-pity, in the same measured tone he might use to describe a weather pattern or a traffic delay. Just facts, just the shape of what had happened and what remained after it. "I know what it is to have someone take what they took a long time to take," he said. "Building it back. That takes a different kind of time." I told him what had happened. All of it. The estate, the trust, Diane's plan, the wiped phone, the wrong bag. He listened without interrupting, leaning on his mop with the patience of someone who understood that some stories need to be said before they can be processed. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have someone you trust who can come for you?" he asked. My 2 closest friends were both traveling for the holiday. My apartment manager did not know my family. The nursing colleagues I might have called were 3 years of friendship, not emergency contact friendship. I shook my head. Walter reached into his chest pocket and produced a phone, older, the kind with actual buttons, the kind that was almost comforting in its simplicity. "I keep a second one," he said. "Wife's idea. Before everything. Old habits." He handed it to me. "Call whoever you need." I had memorized exactly 2 phone numbers by heart because of a childhood habit my father had insisted on before smartphones made memorization obsolete. My father's number, which rang a disconnected line now and broke something in my chest when it did, and the number of his attorney, James Whitfield, because my father had made me memorize it the summer I turned 16 for reasons he never fully explained at the time. I called Whitfield's office, expecting a machine, and got one, left a message that probably sounded less coherent than I intended, explained where I was and what had happened, and asked if anyone could hear it before the holiday. I had no real expectation it would accomplish anything before morning. Walter had gone back to mopping, giving me the dignity of privacy while I figured out my next move. I watched him work. There was something deliberate about the way he maintained that floor, an attention that had nothing to do with the job title and everything to do with who he was underneath it. After a while, I walked over and returned his phone and told him thank you. He looked at me for a long moment. "You have his eyes," he said quietly. I did not understand. Whose eyes? He set down his mop and turned to face me fully. The look on his face was not strange or mystical. It was the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just recognized where it was supposed to be delivered. "Your father," he said. "James Mitchell. I worked with him 23 years ago on the infrastructure project at the Port of Wilmington. Before the freight company, we were contractors on the same job for 8 months. Good man, careful man. The kind of man who noticed the things other people walked past." The terminal seemed to contract around me. My father had worked a port project in Wilmington early in his career. He had mentioned it, briefly, as a difficult job, a long way from home. I had never heard him mention anyone from it by name. "You knew my father," Walter nodded. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a wallet-sized photograph, worn at the corners. The kind of thing a person carries not because they look at it often but because they cannot put it down. He handed it to me carefully. It was a work photograph. A group of men in hard hats standing in front of a section of unfinished port infrastructure, all of them squinting in the coastal sun. In the back row, younger but unmistakable, was my father. And beside him, thinner, no silver in his hair yet but the same steady eyes, was Walter. "He wrote me a letter," Walter said. "After I lost the job. He heard what had happened and he wrote me a letter. Not an email, a letter. He said he was sorry the world let that happen to me and he hoped I found solid ground again someday. He said some people build things because they love the building and the world is better for having them in it. He wrote it on his company letterhead and he signed it with his full name." I had no way to respond. I did not know where he was by then. But I kept that letter until it fell apart and I memorized it before it did. Walter paused. I saw in the Raleigh paper that he passed. This past spring. I wanted to go to the service, but I did not know if that was appropriate. A man he knew for 8 months 20 years ago. "He would have wanted you there," I said, and meant it absolutely. Walter nodded, absorbing that. Then something shifted in his expression, a slight sharpening. He picked up his phone from his cart pocket. "There was a man," he said carefully, "who contacted the terminal about 3 months ago. He was looking for someone to reach out to if a woman matching a certain description ever came through alone. Young, dark hair, eyes a specific shade of green. The name on his contact card said Whitfield and Associates. He said if such a woman appeared to call the number immediately, day or night." My throat tightened. That was my father's attorney, James Whitfield. Walter was already dialing. The conversation was short. Walter gave his name, gave mine, said where we were, said I was safe. The person on the other end spoke for less than 30 seconds. When Walter hung up, he looked at me with an expression that contained something I could not immediately name. "Someone is coming," he said, "from the private office downtown. They said to tell you something first. He said it was a password, something you would understand. He said, 'The yellow ones were always your favorite.'" The air left my lungs. My father. Every birthday? Without exception. Not the traditional red roses. Not whatever was on sale. Yellow roses, because I had told him once when I was 6 that they looked like small suns and he never forgot it. Nobody knew that. Not Diane. Not my friends. Nobody I had told or thought to tell. It was the kind of small and perfect thing that exists only between 2 people and disappears when one of them is gone. Except apparently, it had not disappeared. The man who arrived at the terminal 40 minutes later was not my father. I want to be honest about that, about the moment between reading the message and seeing who walked through the doors, a moment that contained an irrational and desperate hope that I have never told anyone about until now. The man who walked through the doors was in his 50s. Compact, silver-streaked beard, wearing a wool coat over jeans in a way that suggested he had dressed quickly and did not care how it looked. He carried a leather briefcase and moved through the terminal with the directional focus of someone who knew exactly where to go. His name was Richard Park. He had been my father's business partner for 11 years. They had built Mitchell and Park Civil Engineering together from a two-person firm in a borrowed office to a company with 34 employees and projects across 4 states. I had met Richard twice at company events when I was in high school. A quiet man who shook my hand and asked me actual questions and listened to the answers, which was unusual enough in a room full of adults that I remembered it. He sat across from me with his briefcase open between us, and he told me things in a methodical, unhurried way that gradually rearranged every assumption I had been operating on for the past year and a half. My father's death had not been a heart attack. He had been poisoned. A slow-acting cardiac compound introduced into his coffee over several weeks, undetectable in a standard autopsy, unless you were specifically looking for it and had reason to look. Richard had begun to suspect something was wrong 6 weeks before my father died, when my father had pulled him aside during a site visit and told him he had discovered something about Diane. That she had been meeting with Daniel Marsh, the attorney, not socially, not for estate planning, but to discuss the mechanics of contesting a trust that she could not legally access. My father had hired a private investigator. The investigator had found meetings, financial transfers, communications between Diane and Marsh that outlined a strategy for challenging the trust, removing me as primary beneficiary, and positioning Diane for full inheritance if my father died within a certain window. The investigator's report was dated 3 weeks before my father's cardiac event. My father had given a sealed copy to Richard with instructions to protect it and to find me if anything happened. Something had happened. Richard had spent the 18 months since my father's death working with a forensic accountant and a former FBI financial crimes investigator to build the case. The cardiac compound had been identified by a toxicologist my father's original physician consulted when Richard pressed him with the investigator's timeline. The evidence existed. The case existed. What Richard had been missing was me, specifically my testimony, my access to the estate, and my legal standing to pursue charges as the primary victim. Diane had known he was looking. She had hired someone to monitor communications through the estate lawyer's office. Every time Richard came close to reaching me through official channels, the information was intercepted. The approach through the bus terminal had been a contingency, a last resort, something my father had apparently thought of and arranged before he even knew he was in danger. "Your father was a careful man," Richard said, and something about hearing it from someone else who knew him broke open a door I had been holding shut for a year and a half. I pressed my hands flat on the surface of the terminal floor and breathed. "He was," I said. "He was the most careful man I ever knew." Walter had gone back to work at a respectful distance, but when Richard stood and excused himself to make calls, Walter came and sat in the chair across from me without being asked. He did not say anything for a while. He just sat there the way certain people can sit, present and uncrowded, like company that costs nothing. "He was looking for you a long time," Walter said finally. "Your father, not Richard, your father. He came to see me once, maybe 6 years ago. He said he was doing a project near Charlotte, and he looked me up. We had lunch. He told me about you. Said you were studying nursing and you were going to be the kind of nurse who made the work matter. Said it with a particular pride." Walter folded his hands in his lap. I never told him how much the letter meant. Should have. "Always one more thing you should have said." "I know," I said. Richard returned with a woman in a dark coat and a federal ID badge who introduced herself as Special Agent Carolyn Tate, Financial Crimes Division. She had been on the case for 4 months, she said. She confirmed what Richard had told me and added dimensions that made the structure of it larger and darker than I had understood. Daniel Marsh, Diane's attorney, had handled 3 other estate challenges in the past decade with similar characteristics. The compound used on my father had appeared in 2 previous unexplained cardiac deaths involving wealthy individuals with contested estates. The cases had never been connected before Richard's investigator pulled the thread. They were connected now. Diane was in Raleigh. Agent Tate told me with a flat calm that Diane and Marsh had spent the previous evening attempting to file an emergency motion with the estate court to freeze the trust and accelerate the dissolution proceedings. The filing had been flagged automatically because of the active investigation. Diane did not know it had been flagged. She did not know Richard had found me. As far as she knew, I was stranded at a bus terminal on Christmas Eve with no way to contact anyone, no identification, no ability to appear in court, and the window she needed was opening. "We have everything we need," Agent Tate said. "We have been ready to move for 2 months. We were waiting for you. For me, your testimony, your legal standing as the beneficiary, your willingness to proceed. Without you, the charges are financial crimes, significant but manageable for someone with Marsh's resources and connections. With you, with what you know and what your father left in evidence, it becomes what it actually is." "What is it, actually?" She did not hesitate. "Premeditated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, obstruction, witness tampering." She paused. "The other 2 cases are being reopened. There are other families who may finally get answers." I thought about my father at the kitchen table, humming under his breath while he drew his careful diagrams. I thought about the letter he wrote to Walter, a man he had known for 8 months, because he believed it mattered to put kindness in writing. I thought about the yellow roses every birthday without exception, because I had said something once when I was 6 and he remembered it for the rest of his life. I thought about Diane sitting in my father's house right now, in front of the Christmas tree he had bought and decorated alone the last Christmas of his life, believing she had handled everything. "Tell me what you need from me," I said. We drove to Raleigh in Richard's car, Agent Tate following in a second vehicle, 2 additional agents already in position outside the house. I sat in the passenger seat watching the highway lights slide past and said nothing for most of the drive. Richard did not push conversation. He turned on the radio, something low and instrumental, and drove with both hands on the wheel the way my father always had. Halfway there, almost without meaning to, I started talking about my father, the bridges, the Sunday calls, the coffee, the way he could be completely silent in a room, and somehow the room felt more occupied for it. Richard listened and added his own pieces, stories about my father from the years I had not been present for, the project in Kentucky, where he had refused to cut a structural corner and cost the firm a contract and lost sleep over it anyway because of the families that would eventually use that bridge, the quarterly meeting where he had stood up in front of investors and said he would rather run a small, honest company than a large, dishonest one. I had not known any of these stories. They felt like gifts, small and solid, each one something I could keep. When we reached the house in Raleigh, the porch lights were on. Through the front window, I could see the glow of the Christmas tree. Agent Tate's radio crackled once with a confirmation tone. 4 vehicles, 2 sets of agents. I asked if I could go in first. Alone. 5 minutes before anything official happened. Tate looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. I knocked on the door of my father's house. My father's house, not hers. Whatever she had been telling herself for 18 months. Diane opened it, and the composure on her face slipped for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. A crack in plaster, quickly smoothed. "Emma." Her voice was warm and manufactured. "I thought you had gone back to Charlotte." "The bus left without me," I said. "My phone was dead. You already knew that." She began to say something layered and pre-constructed about how worried she had been, how the phone must have been low when she handed it to me, how she hoped my journey had been all right. I watched her speak the way you watch a performance you have seen too many times to be moved by. "I have one question," I said, and she stopped. "In my father's last weeks, he was sick. He was slowing down, getting tired more than he used to. You told me on the phone that he had seemed fine, that it came out of nowhere, that there were no signs." She began to agree with me. "I need you to know that I know you were lying," I said. "I need you to understand that everything you spent the past 1.5 years building, every motion and filing and strategy, every phone that was reset and wallet that went missing, I need you to know it did not work. None of it worked. He was too careful, and too careful men leave instructions." Her face had gone still in a way that was different from composure. It was the stillness of someone whose internal calculation had suddenly produced a number that did not balance. "He left me evidence," I said. "He left me Richard. He left me Walter. He left people I did not even know were watching over me, because that is the kind of man he was, the kind who thought ahead, who built things to last, who considered the weight and the structure, and who was going to need it to hold." Agent Tate stepped up behind me at that moment, badge visible, voice professional and without temperature. "Diane Ashford Mitchell." You are under arrest for the murder of James Aaron Mitchell, conspiracy to commit fraud, and tampering with estate proceedings. Marsh was arrested in Charlotte 40 minutes ago, she added, in case that calculation needed more data. Diane looked past me once, quickly, the way someone looks for an exit that is not there. Then she looked at me, and for a moment, just a moment, something shifted in her face. Not remorse. I will not claim it was remorse, but something more honest than anything she had shown me in 16 years. A kind of recognition that the thing she had underestimated was not the money or the lawyers or the investigation. It was me, the daughter she had tried to make into a parenthesis. I am the only person he left everything to, I said. Not the trust fund. That was just money. I mean the careful attention, the forethought, the yellow roses and the memorized phone numbers, and the letter to a man he worked with for 8 months 20 years ago because he believed it mattered to put kindness in writing. That is what he left me. And you could not take it because you never saw it. And you could not see it because you were always looking at the wrong things. They led her out, and I stood in the doorway of my father's house and listened to the sound of it, the specific quality of silence that follows something that has finally been said. The trial took 3 months. I testified for 2 days. Marsh took a plea in the 2nd month, and his testimony confirmed everything. The compound, the timeline, the communications, the 2 prior cases that were now being prosecuted in other courts with other families waiting for answers. Diane received 22 years. Marsh received 18. The judge, in sentencing, used the word premeditated 11 times. I counted. The estate was released to me in full, including the trust, including the business, which Richard and I had already discussed, transferring into a foundation in my father's name focused on infrastructure safety standards, the thing he cared about most, the thing he had refused to compromise even when it cost him. On the day the estate was finalized, I drove to Charlotte and found Walter on his overnight shift, same cart, same measured arcs across the terminal floor. I handed him a letter of my own, not a job offer, not a check, though those came later. Just a letter, on paper, signed with my full name, that said what it needed to say about his kindness on Christmas Eve and what my father had written about him in the margins of his notebooks, that Walter had been one of the best people he had ever worked beside, that he had always hoped Walter found solid ground. Walter read the letter slowly, all the way through, and then folded it with the precision of someone who intended to keep it. "He would have been proud of you," Walter said. "He already was," I said. That was the thing about him. He did not wait to see how things turned out. He was proud of me when I was 6 and I liked yellow flowers. He was proud of me every Sunday when I called, every small, ordinary version of my life. I spent a long time thinking I needed to do something significant enough to deserve it. He never thought that. Walter put the letter in his chest pocket, right next to where he had carried my father's letter for decades, and went back to his work. I drove home through the early morning, before sunrise, the highway quiet, and the fields along I-85 gray and still. Somewhere outside of Concord, I turned on the radio and found something instrumental and low, and I hummed along with it, just under my breath, without meaning to at first and then on purpose. It sounded, I thought, exactly like a man at peace with where he was. And for the first time in a very long time, so did I.